According to Eric Hobsbawm, the French Revolution was a set of events that created the notion that history could be transformed through the action of people. It left as a legacy the democratic principles of freedom, equality, and fraternity. In this video, we'll talk about some aspects of the French Revolution and the government of Napoleon Bonaparte. First, let's take a look at how society was divided at the time. At the end of the 18th century, France had 28 million inhabitants. The top of the social pyramid was occupied by the first state. It had around 120,000 members of the Catholic Church. The clergy controlled 20% of French land and held numerous privileges, such as exemption from taxes. The second state was formed by the nobility, composed of approximately 400,000 people. They had a status superior to that of the majority of the clergy. They consisted of the royal family, the courtiers, the nobles that had purchased titles of nobility, the descendants of the ancient feudal families. The nobles also did not pay taxes and lived mainly off exploitation of the work of peasants. In the third state, there was about 98% of the French population. The third state was composed of bankers, ship owners and big business owners, medium-sized business owners, merchants, small traders, urban workers, and peasants. This group collected taxes for the state, the nobility, and the clergy. In the last decades of the 18th century, when France was facing a deep economic crisis that was caused mainly by spending on wars, about 80% of peasant income was used to pay taxes. Between 1785 and 1788, food prices increased due to a strong drought and due to the poor results of the agricultural harvest. The hunger spread, causing death, desolation, and migrations. Many became beggars, others started to steal. In Paris and other cities, artisans and workers began to strike. Store looting and demonstrations against the government's economic policy spread. To solve the losses of public accounts, in 1789 the Minister of Finance proposed that the first and second states begin to pay taxes. To discuss the issue, King Louis XVI summoned the States General, an advisory body formed by representatives of the three states. Nobility and clergy together were in the majority, as each state was entitled to one vote. Representatives of the third state requested a change in how the votes were counted, demanding that it be by hand. As the impasse dragged on, these representatives met separately and proclaimed themselves a National Assembly destined to draft a constitution. Unable to dissolve the meeting, the king ordered the representatives of the nobility and of the clergy to join. With that, on July 9, 1789, the States General proclaimed the formation of a National Constituent Assembly. Behind the scenes, Louis XVI called the army to dissolve the assembly. When the news spread across Paris, a mob in revolt raided government arsenals and seized 30,000 muskets, and then left for the Bastille, fortress in which the government imprisoned and tortured its opponents. Although it was practically disabled, the Bastille was one of the greatest symbols of absolutism. Its downfall and loss of control to the population was a significant event. Uprisings and revolts by peasants and urban workers spread across the country, prompting the Constituent Assembly to abolish feudal laws still existing and to suppress the privileges of the nobility and the clergy. On August 4, 1789, the Assembly decreed the end of the old regime. It was proclaimed the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen. Among other achievements, the document established freedom and equality of all before the law. Currently, this document is considered one of the foundations of the contemporary state. Over the next years, the constituents drafted and promulgated the first constitution of France. In October 1791, the National Legislative Assembly was elected. The state was divided into three powers, executive, legislative, and judiciary, and defined the constitutional monarchy as a form of government. The king would be the head of the executive, but should follow the constitutional norms and would be supervised by the legislative, composed of deputies elected by census vote. In June 1791, Louis XVI tried to flee with his family to Austria, but was arrested. The government passed into the hands of a provisional executive council. The Legislative Assembly was dissolved, and the National Convention was elected in its place. The Jacobins, representing mainly the small and middle bourgeoisie, won the majority of votes. They defended the Republic and universal suffrage. Another group was that of the Girondins, representatives of the big bourgeoisie merchant, who sought to negotiate with the king. On September 22, 1792, the convention proclaimed the Republic. Louis XVI was brought to trial for treason and executed at the guillotine. A Republican constitution was drafted, granting universal male suffrage. The beginning of the French Republic was turbulent. Troops from England, Austria, Prussia, Holland, Spain, Russia, and Sardinia attacked French territory, trying to prevent the consolidation of the Republic and the spread of its ideals. In different parts of the country, nobles organized counter-revolutionary movements. To face these difficulties, in April 1793, the convention created a Committee of Public Safety headed by Danton and soon after by Robespierre. They summoned 300,000 men to fight the foreigners, which provoked a violent reaction in provinces still faithful to the monarchy and created a revolutionary court to try suspects of counter-revolutionary attitudes. About 300,000 French were arrested, accused of being enemies to the revolution. This phase, which lasted approximately 1 year, became known as Terror. Among the main targets of the court were representatives of the upper bourgeoisie, whose business and personal relationships brought them closer to the nobility. The Jacobin government initially had strong popular support, since it created taxes on the rich, fixed a ceiling on the prices of products, regulated wages, opened public schools, distributed the goods of the nobles who had gone into exile, and promoted a distribution of the land that benefited millions of people. It also instituted divorce, decreed religious freedom, and abolished slavery in the French colonies. But the repression led the Jacobins to lose support from the population. Robespierre and his companions were overthrown by their opponents at the convention on July 27, 1794, marking the start of the Thermidorian reaction. In 1795, a new republican constitution of a liberal character reinstituted the vote of male proprietors. The executive power was in the hands of the Directory, which was composed of 5 people elected from among the deputies. During this period, France faced serious financial difficulties and strong political instability. To contain popular manifestations, the Directory turned to the army, then led by the young general Napoleon Bonaparte. Success in suppressing revolts and in military campaigns abroad guaranteed Napoleon enough prestige to be invited to participate in the Directory. Soon he dissolved the parliament and replaced the Directory with 3 provisional councils. In less than a month of the consulate, a new constitution was drawn up which gave Napoleon the title of First Consul of France. Napoleon's government promoted reforms aiming to recover the economy and institutions, but he also pardoned the nobles who had previously been exiled, reorganized the collection system for taxes, created a new currency, promoted educational reforms, and instituted the civil code. In 1802, a plebiscite granted Napoleon the lifetime consul title. 2 years later, another popular consultation turned France into an empire. In 1805, the government of Bonaparte annexed the Republic of Genoa. Several European nations united to stop the expansion of the French Empire. France had as its main rival England, the most economically developed nation at the time. Knowing that British power supported itself in commerce and industry, Napoleon's government prohibited European nations from trading with England. Countries that did not participate in the continental blockade would be attacked by the Napoleonic army. As the governments of Portugal and Spain did not join the boycott, in 1807, French troops invaded the Iberian Peninsula. The King of Spain was replaced with Napoleon's brother. This had an impact in the Spanish colonies of America, where emancipationist movements gained ground. The Portuguese royal family and court fled to Brazil. The continental blockade also reached Russia, which exported raw materials to England. In 1811, Tsar Alexander I broke the boycott and opened the country's ports to British ships. In retaliation, Napoleon declared war on Russia, but they were unprepared to face the harsh Russian winter, and Napoleon returned to France in 1812 with only 100,000 of the 600,000 recruited soldiers. With the French defeat, England, Prussia, and Austria unraveled a fulminating attack on France which could not stop the opposing coalition. In April of 1814, Napoleon abdicated the throne and was exiled on the island of Elba in the Mediterranean Sea, while France organized a new government under Louis XVIII, brother of Louis XVI. Representatives of European countries gathered in Vienna, Austria, to define the new frontiers between nations. Two basic principles guided the participants of the so-called Congress of Vienna: the one of legitimacy, which advocated the restoration of dynasties considered legitimate by Congress and later dismissed, of the French Revolution and the government of Napoleon, and the principle of balance of forces between the great powers. In February 1815, Napoleon fled the island of Elba and landed in France ahead of a group of followers. The new emperor's rule, however, would last just under 100 days away from power. Bonaparte was sent to St. Helena, a small island in the Atlantic, where he died in 1821. In France, Louis XVIII returned to the throne.